Okay, Branko, let me start with 2 or 3 points that you make in the book, but there's one question in particular. I mean, one point I think that you make, but which, when I read it again, it's an obvious point, but it kind of, made me, again, concentrate, is that, I mean, take a person who has $1 million and a person who has $10,000 annual income, and both have a 10% increase. So one gets another $1,000, the other one gets $100,000, okay? The income distribution remains the same between these two, but the absolute increase is 1,000 versus 100,000. So when we look at social phenomenon and political phenomenon and all that, I mean, I wonder whether in your research you've come across that point, because income distribution as a relative concept is one thing, but the actual gains, when you compare gains, can be overwhelmingly different without changing the distribution. And sometimes I wonder that even at an equal distribution, whether the gains in absolute terms have an impact on Carol Graham's happiness statistics or whatever. That's just a point, but you may want to react to it. The real question I want to ask to start the discussion has to do with the Kuznets waves. And I may be wrong, because I haven't gone back and reread Kuznets and so on, but I had the feeling that his wave was essentially a wave that was endogenously economic. It had to do with rural-urban migration, with kind of economic forces. Whereas your waves are political economic waves. Am I correct?
You are.
In saying that, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit.
Great. Thank you very much, Kemal. Let me just go over these 2 questions. The first one, of course, we tend to work with relatives. And of course, when I described that, sliding scale of gains and losses, it was all in relative terms. And one has to realize that what is in relative terms for people who are actually making $5 a day is like doubling. In absolute terms, for the rich people, is really sort of peanuts. So they're like a rounding error. But inequality measures, I'll give you a small example, actually. You always are much more alert to these examples when it happens to you. For example, I'm very proud of having like 20,000 followers on Twitter. And the other day I was talking to Paul Krugman, and he says, well, I have, 1,540,000 or 1,640,000. And what was the rounding error for Paul was like more than a total amount of followers that I had. So this is the absolute things, And even if we grow maybe by percentage terms the same, I gain 1 follower and he gains 100,000 or something like that. So that actually our work is always in relatives. And as Kemal said, if you then took a different approach and say, okay, the whole GDP of the world has gone up between 1988 and 2011 by 100, who got that 100? And then, of course, you see that about, I think, 47% was gained by the top 1%. So in that sense, the gains were very unequal in absolute terms, even if people in Asia did extremely well. But as I said before, their absolute gains were relatively small if you just look at the part of the additional pie that they got. Now, on the second question, on the Kuznets waves, actually, I'm glad that you asked that. We didn't plan this. But, of course, I can go a long time on that. But it's true. Kuznets had essentially an economic view of the waves, which drives the waves. Or actually, in his case, he only had one curve. He thought that basically, which is reasonable if you are sitting and writing 1960, you thought actually you saw that there was a decline in inequality, and you thought the rich countries would become countries with low level of inequality, relatively old population, large social transfers, unemployment benefits. You would not see why inequality would go up again, which of course provided many problems with the Kuznets curve to start with. In my case, I think actually I see the forces of politics, institutional redesigns, and war actually as very strong forces. I think we were helped to thinking about war, I would say, by Piketty's book. He brings the war really at the center stage. we tended to forget words, maybe a little bit wrongly. And I actually argue, but I will not go into that, but I call it in what I call I argue about endogeneity of World War I. I think actually argue that World War I was to some extent precipitated by rising inequalities in the belligerent countries before the war. That's a somewhat old theory of imperialist origins of World War I, but it was only 2 pages in my book. I wrote much more, but actually my editor wisely said, you don't want to have this book a discussion of the origins of World War I because everybody in the world has an opinion on that. So that's not really what is the forte of the book. But I do see political elements as playing much more of a role than in the original formulation. For me, it's a little bit also puzzling that Kuznets, who worked actually in the Office of Prices and whatever it's called, which really dealt with the war, really never mentioned the war as an element that really led through taxation in the US of reducing inequality. But maybe I missed somewhere what he wrote.
Thank you, Branko. Carol, I'll turn to you now to give your comments, questions, perspective.
Okay, well, I'm supposed to be the optimist because I work on happiness, but I'm going to have to try hard to do that. But about the book, I'm very optimistic. This is a terrific book. It's not surprising. Branko has a long line of them. But just a couple of key features. It's just remarkable in its clarity and explanatory power. So the metrics that we use to measure inequality are complex, even this issue of relative versus absolute. The average person can't understand why standard economics wouldn't care that a billionaire gains 100,000 and a poor person gains 1,000, and we don't see that as an increase in inequality. So there are lots of complicated metrics that we use to measure inequality, and Branko does an amazing job in making these accessible to just the lay reader, the informed lay reader. For example, we were talking about this earlier, a great example he has in a little box in the book is, well, so what does it mean to be a billionaire? How much money do you have to spend? You know, most of us can't conceive of that. He says, well, if you inherit $1 billion, you would have, and you spent $1,000 a day, which is sort of large by most people's standards, it would take you 2,700 years to blow your inheritance. So that's a lot of money. That's out of the range of imagination for most people. But what Branko does so well is he puts, you know, a real world element to that. And that's very rare in books written by economists. And I'm one of them, so I confess to be in the same group. The other thing that he does so well is he really weaves in, as he was talking about the wars, a really keen sense of history, of politics, and literature, even in his writing. And so it makes the book a real pleasure to read, in addition to a real learning experience. Now, obviously, I can't cover everything in the book and then also try and say something new in about 5 minutes. So I just want to talk about a couple of key themes in the book and how those link to some new work I've been doing on current trends in well-being and ill-being in the United States. So one key theme is this concept of Kuznets waves, the curves that Kamal has been carrying all around the world. And so the idea is that rather than seeing inequality as something that first increases with development and then goes away or declines, this waves hypothesis suggests that it's a process that can reoccur and reoccur over time, along with economic, technological, and political changes. So that is a very new element in the discussion of Kuznets. But it does a great job of describing the situation today. So in today's Kuznets waves, the big winners are the very wealthy in the rich countries, and the poor and middle classes in the emerging market economies, particularly Asia. And the biggest losers, in contrast, are the lower middle classes in the rich countries. And the losers in this story are driving two worrisome forces, populism and nativism. And these forces could, in the end, result in a very costly backlash against globalization. And it's something that we're already seeing in both Europe and the US in very heightened political debates. So within this scenario, the US stands out as sort of the poster child for inequality, as the data also suggests. And as Branko just described, we have this perfect storm of inequality, and he described the forces that lead to that, so I'm not going to repeat that, but it is very relevant to what's going on in terms of the backlash in this country. So the perfect storm has already resulted in very worrisome trends. And my work on inequality of well-being in the United States finds some really remarkably stark trends in the data. One example, I'm from Peru and always, grew up thinking the U.S. was a land of opportunity, as many first-generation immigrants do. But the poor in the U.S. today are much less likely to believe that hard work will get them ahead than are the poor in Latin America, significantly so. And when I saw that figure, I was wondering if it was a data miscode or something, and I kept going back to make sure that was correct. And then optimism about the future, which we find in both empirical work and experimental data. Optimism about the future is very much linked to people's willingness to invest in those futures. If you believe in your future, you're likely to invest in that future and those of your children. If you don't think you have a future, why bother? What we find is in the US, there's no optimism in the future. There's deep desperation among certain groups. And what I think you've increasingly been reading about in the papers today, although I was finding this over a year ago, is that the most miserable and unhappy group and the most pessimistic about the future in the US are poor whites. That surprised me when I first found it. It equally surprised me that poor blacks are the most optimistic of the poor groups. Poor blacks actually score almost a whole point higher on a 10-point future optimism scale. That's a very big change than do poor whites. Poor Hispanics are somewhere in the middle, but poor blacks are very much the most optimistic groups. And these differential views about the future are also playing out in our mortality trends. The US mortality rate is being driven up by preventable deaths among poor and uneducated middle-aged whites. Suicide, opioid and other drug addiction, diabetes, obesity. That is not, blacks and Hispanics are not part of that trend. Their mortality rates have continued to fall. Indeed, black life expectancy, while still lower than that of whites, has narrowed the gap from a 7-year difference in 1990 to just over a 3-year difference now. So you're really seeing this backslide in terms of progress, in terms of optimism, in terms of all kinds of things among poor whites and also near middle-class whites. And when you look at what drives these differences in attitudes, I could go on for a long time, but I won't. But the one thing that's, I think, very compelling is that poor and middle-income blacks are much more likely to be comparing themselves to parents who were worse off than they were. Meanwhile, poor and blue-collar whites are comparing themselves to parents who had a much more secure existence and much more stable employment. And so the political ramifications of these trends are stark. Donald Trump is clearly one of them. But I think there are also more pockets of racism, nativism, and other political backlashes driven by concerns about downward mobility and falling even further behind. So as Branko describes this perfect storm, it's clear it's not going to go away by itself. And the solutions are deep-seated ones, which aren't readily resolved in political debates like the one we're having now, but they require addressing inequality in endowments up front and not just redistribution ex post. So let's hope, trying to be optimistic here, that as a society we can get past the daunting hurdle of the 2016 elections and begin to think about productive policy solutions. And if there's a good part of the story in terms of how frightening the political debate is, maybe it will produce some sort of wake-up call. And clearly the US is not the only critical player, and this is also occurring in Europe. But clearly, if unhappiness among downwardly mobile Americans drives a major backlash against trade, immigration, and globalization more generally, it's hard to imagine that there wouldn't be a more negative fallout for the rest of the global economy. So I'm going to try and end on a more upbeat note, which is you really have to read this book. It's a great book. And also, hopefully, it will trigger some productive policy thinking in the future.
Thank you very much, Carol. Just one point of clarification, again, about the data we're talking about. And it's particularly, I think, important in the comparison Europe-US. We are basically using household consumption data.
Yeah, right? I do. Yes, absolutely. Right. Income, or actually income.
Income,
yes.
Consumption data. Okay, but income after government transfers.
Right. After government transfers and taxes.
And
yes.
taxes.
Yes.
Although some in-kind government transfers may not be there.
That's true. Actually, in that sense, it underestimates incomes where you have large government-paid health and education.
Yeah. Exactly. But I think it's very important to remember what numbers one talks about, because there are the pre-policy numbers, there are the post-policy up to a point, and then you can even go further and try to impute value to
Absolutely.
things which are not there.
Just for actually people to, maybe some people know, but for example, Piketty size numbers are numbers which are only market income, which means that does not include government transfers and does not deduct direct taxation.
Yeah.
My numbers are actually including both of these elements.
Right. And am I correct in saying that the pre-policy and post-policy difference, while positive in the US, I mean, there's
Right,
more,
of course, yeah.
is much larger in Europe?
Yes, it's significantly larger in Europe. Yeah, US is very, I was very brief, but US is very interesting because it has slightly higher market inequality, underlying inequality than most European countries, but not dramatically higher.
right.
But it also redistributes less. So US actually is kind of more, let's suppose, let's call it moderate. I mean, it has relatively high inequality, underlying inequality, but moderate redistribution. So that's basically what, when you compare US to other rich countries, that's what you find.
I mean, the point I'm trying to make here is that it seems that economies that are basically market economies have been able, up to now at least, to redistribute a significant amount from a starting point which was unequal and without too many differences between these market economies. I just wanted to...
But I want to say actually what Carol mentioned about the endowments, you have a small example of countries that actually have more equal underlying market inequality, and these are Asian countries. And unfortunately, I've got only 3 of them because there are not that many rich Asian countries. It's Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. They actually, particularly interesting example is Taiwan. They start with relatively low market income inequality. So in order for them to reach the level, for Taiwan, to reach the level of inequality of Canada, they don't need to distribute more than 15% of income. And Canada needs to redistribute 50%. So that's really the difference.
Okay.
Can I just a quick point about overtime trends in the U.S., which I think stand out. If you look at what's been going on with redistribution in the U.S. over the same years that inequalities increased so much, but the past 2 decades, things like TAMF and other aid to the poorest have been falling dramatically. I mean, the charts are very stark, and the language around redistribution has also become very much more divisive. You know, if the programs, the redistributed programs in the U.S. very much stigmatize the poor, in contrast with programs in Latin America, for example, which do the opposite.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I just want to, let's just always keep in mind what distribution we're talking about, market or after. Now, Eduardo, sorry for breaking in here, but now we're ready for your perspectives. Anything you want to, emphasize, and hopefully a little bit also on the political kind of flavors that we perceive these days.
Well, first, maybe I should offer a disclaimer. Unlike my partners here on stage, I am not an economist, not a social scientist. I just play one in a newspaper, and so I'm a little intimidated here at my partners here. But I would like to offer some thoughts on Branko's fantastic work. I wrote a piece about your work, I think maybe 3 years ago. About the first time that I encountered your lying down S of the distribution of global incomes. And a question that's been gnawing at me ever since I wrote that piece, and in fact I think I alluded to this when writing of it, was whether the overall net dynamic that we were seeing was a good or a bad thing. Because this S shows declining inequality between countries, but rising inequality within countries, including at the stage, I think, of your data in China, as in the United States and many other rich countries. And of course, perhaps what we would ideally like to see, I mean, if you're of an egalitarian bent, would be declining inequality everywhere. But given that we had this sort of distribution, I wondered, well, what could we conclude from a normative point of view? Because there's an interaction between these two things, of course, right? I mean, part of the increase in inequality in the United States has a lot to do with, globalization, technological change that has enabled large shares of production to move to poor countries, which have then brought millions of people out of poverty. So there's an interaction between these two phenomena. And it does leave to me a question, is this great? And I remember I called Danny Roderick, who said, yes, this is great, because we've decreased the Frantz Fanon inequality, but written in an American newspaper and read by, the folks at the AFL-CIO, They were like, what do you mean? At the cost of our welfare, this was our welfare, and so we're happy because it helped poor Chinese. So I think that's a really interesting question. I don't have, solutions about it, but I find it interesting. And from that, and yet I wonder whether this combination of dynamics is actually going to continue or not. And you mentioned that you were optimistic about the convergence between countries. And I'm going to, perhaps unfairly profit from the fact that you included Brazil in your list as a proof of convergence. Well, actually, the IMF suggests that between now and 2017 or 18, the Brazilian economy is going to shrink by 10%. Income per capita there is in, fairly bad shape. And if you ask me, is Brazil on the verge of a China? Is there a chance that it becomes a Korea? And I look at how its economy is kind of like very heavily dependent on commodities, very low human capital. I would say not a chance. And so this leads me to a broader thought, which is the idea that the countries that you refer to in Asia that have actually made the leap, Taiwan, Korea, to some extent China, which came from very, very steep poverty into kind of middle income status, have been based on basically building manufacturers to sell them to the rich world. And there is a good argument to be made that kind of path is becoming closed to future countries. So if you look at the share of, say, employment in manufacturing across different countries that have developed over different periods of time, amongst the countries that developed very early, like the UK, the United States, Europe, you see very, very high shares of manufacturing employment. And as you move over time, you find that manufacturing employment peaks at a lower level of income. So manufacturing employment is giving you less bang, less kind of like economic development bang. And this has been a gradual process that has taken place over decades. So the question to me is, if the path that we knew works is losing a lot of its oomph, what will replace it? And this is the particularly, say, pertinent question for India, which you mentioned. And Prime Minister Modi has suggested that India will have an industrial renaissance. And I think there's good reasons to be very skeptical that will in fact happen. Not only because, China already takes up a large share of the manufacturing, say, space, but also because of technological change and forces like reshoring, bringing manufacturing back to rich countries because you can use more technology and so cheap labor is not necessarily as important. Hence, transportation costs become more important, energy costs become more important, and your distribution of global manufacturing, which benefited employment in poor countries, is now being reorganized in a different sort of way. So that leads me kind of like to be perhaps more pessimistic than you are on the convergence. And on the internal factors, I would, looking at China today, I would agree with you that perhaps that's a good example of a country that's hitting the down part of the Kuznets curve, where income inequality declines as wages rise more broadly. But pretty much, everywhere, that's a rare exception. If you ask me, and if you look at most industrialized countries, and even countries where there has been some decline in inequality, like Latin America, Mexico, where I'm from, and Brazil, I find it very difficult to see what are the forces that, which will need to be sustained over a fairly long period of time, that would actually bring inequality down. Again, the United States is perhaps the worst possible place to think about in terms of, reducing inequality, but I find it's very important. Not only because of the intensity of inequality and the size of the country, but also, in terms of kind of like perhaps policy lessons that could be shared around the world. And if you look at the moment where inequality declined in the United States, which is essentially after the New Deal and World War II, the policy changes that brought this about, which are essentially, new government regulations and a large increase in taxation and redistribution were brought about by a very, very unique circumstance, which was World War II. Even before the New Deal, we had the progressive movement, which included a lot of activist government, and the first income tax was passed. We got, the Sherman Act to combat trusts, and even then, the inequality needle moved very little. And it was only when we had this really massive global event that seemed to justify what at the time was called the conscription of capital, of the rich, in the service of the national purpose, did we manage to reduce the inequality in the country. And so standing here today, I see really no kind of like discontinuity of the magnitude of World War II. Say, not even Donald Trump does that, right? That might actually induce the system to kind of like make the changes in policy that did it in the past. My thoughts are not entirely pessimistic. And I note that you spend some time kind of like speculating on what might be the forces that could reduce inequality again in the United States. And you mentioned that perhaps new technologies that kind of like replace the work of the rich rather than the work of the poor, so pro-poor technological change might be a way. You also mentioned other policy changes, like, for instance, perhaps higher inheritance taxes so that you could have a better distribution of wealth, and policies that would lead to better distribution of education, of human capital, so that we might get into a situation more like Taiwan. And I was going to add one more that I think is potentially powerful and also potentially feasible, which is kind of like reforming the institutions of the market so as to attack what I suspect could be a really big driver of inequality in the United States, which is economic rents. Now, I mean, I might be overblowing the importance of this, but I think there's a growing body of work that suggests that rents, which, drawn by monopoly power, market power over, certain sectors of the economy, are actually contributing significantly to income inequality. The head of the Council of Economic Advisors, Jason Furman, and Peter Orszag wrote a paper not long ago suggesting that inequality of income, which is the biggest inequality in the United States, which is driving income concentration in the United States, it's not mostly wealth, it's mostly about your wages, your market incomes, was happening not within firms, but between firms. So there were firms that were paying, that had the ability to pay much, much more than other firms. And so that they suggested was perhaps evidence of growing rents in the economy, that then these firms could distribute to the top very well, and leading to this increasing concentration of income. So my guess is that the politics of redistribution, if you portrayed them as politics to make markets function better, that is by reducing market concentration, reducing monopoly power, perhaps affecting things like occupational licensing or better application of antitrust, will be more easily digested by the political system than a redistributive agenda, even if it's only limited to like the inheritance tax, or even to a more egalitarian educational agenda, which we haven't managed to put in place despite decades of ostensible reform. This, I do think antitrust has perhaps will have more of a role, a more important role than we might think. And I also think perhaps that the reform of finance could also pack a lot of power in reducing income inequalities. Market concentration in the financial sector, I mean, financiers are amongst one of the big groups in the top 1% and the ones that have benefited of the trend of growing concentration over the last 4 decades. And I think there is by now a pretty solid consensus in this country that finance needs to be reformed in some way or other. I mean, it brings about crises every 3 or 4 years that impose enormous costs on the rest of society. And so the notion that, this sector should not longer be allowed to impose such externalities, or at least should pay for them, is growing. I even heard Larry Summers say this, which was incredibly surprising. And so this, I think, offers an opportunity to address why is it that finance has managed to absorb such a large share of national income, and perhaps, through the regulatory apparatus, through perhaps imposing some price so that they internalize the negative externalities, might allow for a better intersector distribution of income that could actually make for a more equal distribution in the economy.
Thank you.
Yeah, so there you go. Stop there.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. And then I think the issue of monopoly power, I don't know, some of you may have seen Joe Stiglitz's latest Project Syndicate article along those lines, where there are metrics of monopoly power actually having grown quite a bit, particularly in certain sectors, like pharmaceuticals and things like that. But I'd like to add one element to that and then give it back to Branko before we open up to the floor. There is also now new technology leads to the ability to price discriminate, which is amazing. I mean, you all know now that depending on the day, the hour, you take a plane, you pay completely different prices. I mean, those of you who are not too young will remember that 20 years ago there were 1 or 2 prices, 3 prices, and then that was it. I just found out that by changing one day in trying to reserve a flight, it ended up tripling in price. Uber, in a way, is the same model, And when you think about monopoly and market power, while there's something efficient about price discrimination, because every consumer pays like what they're maximally willing to pay, it also absorbs the consumer surplus into whoever does the pricing, okay? And then the big question is, well, why isn't there more market entry? I mean, why is it that Amazon is such a monopoly or close to a monopoly? Or why is it that Google is such a close to monopoly? And I think you've touched on something very important in modern capitalism, that despite world trade, despite globalization, despite the competition from emerging countries and all that, in many sectors, monopoly has dramatically increased, actually. So what does that do to?
But Kim, I would stay actually, because I think we would have lots of policy discussion in a minute. So I would, if you allow me, I would just like to respond to 1 or 2 points of Eduardo, not the policy points, because I'm sure we will actually talk more about that. But these are more technical issues. First of all, on the issue of convergence. One thing which is very important to realize sort of at the level of intuition is what we have seen during the last 25 years of globalization is that you can have rising inequalities practically in all the countries, not all, but 2/3 or 3/4, with global inequality going down. And that's actually sometimes very difficult to sort of have this feeling, but what is really happening is that you really have in each country rising inequality, but there is a catch-up, that's where the convergence come in, between the poor and rich countries, so that dampens the global inequality. So that's very important. Now, why is it also important is because it kind of totally, how should I say, sort of colors your view of what is optimistic, pessimistic, because what is optimistic from one perspective is pessimistic from the other. And to give you an example, optimistically we are saying, well, convergence is very good, the poor countries are catching up with the rich countries. Well, the other side of that face of the coin of that convergence is precisely maybe what we are seeing now in the US and the rich countries, is that actually middle class is not growing. So there you have then optimistic story in the future. There will be other poor countries that would grow. World poverty is going to go down. Africa will actually start becoming, obviously not rich, but middle income and so on. So this is all very rosy picture. But because the world is organized in nation states, that rosy global picture, when you translate it at the level of nation states, it's much less rosy because in rich countries, there is like people who are not growing at all. And in some of the poor countries, inequality has really dramatically increased. So that's where this difficulty comes in, is that you have to keep at all the time these two different, juggle with these balls, and which really tempers your own view to view everything in a sort of rosy colors or to view it in only very, very dark ones. On a second point on these Kuznets waves, I actually do believe that actually Brazil and China provide very good sort of examples for my story, because I actually see both Brazil and China being at the peak, and actually Brazil on the downslide of the first Kuznets wave. And actually, to some case, Brazil is almost poster child for the Kuznets waves, because the movements that have happened in the last 15 years, which reduced inequality in Brazil, are really increasing education, reduced wage premium of the highly educated people, a higher minimum wage, which is exactly the result of social pressures, or maturing of population, greater redistribution, and of course large social transfer programs. So it's actually, Brazil really fits it almost, I would say, perfectly, to the extent that real numbers can fit kind of some, abstract concept. And there I see China also entering that stage. Despite corruption and huge differences between provincial incomes and so on, there is a push towards introduction of much more social transfers than currently. They are basically limited to state-owned enterprises, but there is really push for that. And there is also finally the end of the Lewis type of growth with unlimited supply of labor at a constant wage rate. So, that's why I think both China and Brazil as being good examples of my Kuznets waves. And just to clarify, they would be like going down the first peak, but the US and the rich countries are actually going uphill on the second wave. So that's where I see them as being. Now, obviously, that's not going to fit exactly every country, but if it fits about a dozen large countries, I will be very happy.
Okay, let's open it to the floor. Jed, you raised, and then the lady next. Yeah, first Jed. We'll take two or three.
Jed Schilling,
We'll take 2 or 3 questions at once and then go back.
Okay, well, I have one quick comment and 2 quick questions. The comment with what Carol was saying about looking at different percentage, the same percentage increase at different levels, is one concept that doesn't get a lot of attention in economics, is declining marginal value of money. If you're a poor person making $10,000 a year and get an extra $1,000, it's incredibly valuable because you can finish feeding your family and do a lot of other important things. If you're a millionaire and get an extra $10,000, you probably don't even notice it. And it's not clear that it's increasing your welfare. So more money that goes into the bottom level, even if it's a lower percentage, is going to have a better impact on improving the welfare of the people, not just the incomes. Then a couple of questions. To what extent can you take account of the technological revolution in looking at income distribution? Because the Industrial Revolution created lots of jobs and brought up the lower class. The technological revolution that we're having now is not creating as many jobs, but creating a lot of wealth at the top, and with robotics is eliminating a lot of the working class jobs, which also contributes to the slower growth of the income of the middle and lower classes in the United States, because many of the good manufacturing jobs are lost to robots here, not to people working in China. So how that is taken account would be useful. And then the other thing, going beyond the concern about the rent that's going on and the monopolies, is what I characterize as paper assets, where you now have in the quasi-financial sector these derivatives and lots of other assets that create lots of value and people make lots of money trading, but there's no real production based on that capital. It is just what I call paper capital, and a lot of the people in the finance sector are also making large amounts of money trading daily or every 2 seconds, depending on how they can do it. So you're getting a lot of that level of income that doesn't correspond to creating anything real for the economy, the way income is supposed to do that. So that's another factor I don't know if you can take into account in looking at why and the kinds of income inequality you have.
Thank you. Yes?
Okay, so I'm just going to totally toss in another variable to discuss, but especially in light of like talking about China and India, I feel like it's impossible to not also consider climate change and sort of like climate change brought by a lot of manufacturing. And my question is whether you envision different proposed solutions to climate change to be a sort of boon or like a potential solution also to inequality, or perhaps another perpetuation of inequality.
Thank you. bringing in another big topic into, yeah, anybody? Vito.
There's another question.
And then, yeah, we'll take also you afterwards.
You know, I just published a book, and the title of the book, From Economic Miracle to Stagnation. And in Italy had 30 years of growth, and then it came down to 2%, 1%. In the last 10 years, had been about 0%. The same thing happened to Germany. The same thing happened to Japan. The same thing, to some extent, happened to Korea. And so why this will not happen in China and in India? Because as this country grow, the rest of the world becomes smaller. So the export that they are, they are doing will be much more difficult for the rest of the world to absorb them. So are we sure that really this trend will continue, or what is the view? No, I would be very skeptical that I also wrote a book on China, by the way, and I'm very skeptical that the Chinese will keep growing at this rate, assuming that the rate that we normally measure is the correct one. I have lots of questions about that.
Thank you. Yes?
Thank you. Could you advise, may I ask, how do you see the relationship between the political mechanism and the income inequality? I mean, for example, how do you see the difference of the income equality between democratic countries and the non-democratic authoritarian countries? Do you think that the democratic countries are better in mitigating income inequality because of its function to redistribute income through taxation? Thank you very much.
Well, with that, you have another 5 hours of,
Yes.
I mean, not just yours, but, climate change, convergence, growth. Anyway, pick.
But I would actually be very brief, because actually many of these issues, of course, they're extremely important, but this is just one book, and it's a book which actually deals with global income. And basically what one needs to realize, there is only one variable there, and that variable is income. Now, that does not address questions like what Jed asked, for example, labor. That would be another book, or somebody else should write that book. So obviously the two industrial revolutions, I would go back a little bit in order, industrial revolutions were different, and I'm not totally convinced that the only way to develop is through production of things. I actually believe that we have gradually moved from agricultural societies, because essentially our needs were food, to textiles, to things, and then to services. So this is not something which is universally accepted. People still believe that development is basically manufacturing, but I'm not quite sure that in the future we would see it the same way. But anyway, on labor, on jobs, I don't have much there. Similarly, what you called, was it fictitious capital, or I don't know what? Paper. I think Marx called it fictitious. I don't have much about that either, because obviously these are like sub questions of this big global question, which basically works with, as I said, one variable, which is income. Now, on the same thing, unfortunately, applies to climate change. So I can actually discuss with you that, but as an informed observer. But it's not something that I've studied, and it's in the book. Now, going to Vito's question, why I'm actually, again, I'm looking at that from the global perspective. It does not require for global inequality to go down, that China continues growing at 8%. And actually, China is a very interesting case, because China is now reaching the level where it's maybe even now, 2016, at the level where its growth adds to global inequality. China is now about to become a global inequality disequalizer, because it has become rich. But it is sufficient that other countries grow at the rate which is higher than the growth rate of the rich world. And on that, I would actually take a bet for the next 10 years that the rich countries are going to grow at a lower rate than these 5 countries, which exclude China, that I have in my book, and which are actually, I think, Indonesia, India, South Africa, Brazil, and Vietnam. And I would take a bet really of like 50-1 that these 5 countries are going to grow faster. And if they grow faster, that's a sufficient force to reduce global inequality. So in that sense, I'm optimistic. Now, as I said, I don't think China will continue at 8%, nor will Vietnam, but they would continue maybe at 4.5%, whereas Europe will be at 0%. So that would be still, reduction of global inequality. And one final point I want to mention, before the democracy and totalitarianism, one final point, when you also look at this global inequality, there was a nice idea that John Romer had, and we had a small paper on that, is that actually if you make a welfare function, going back to utility, which doesn't have only your income, but has your income in relative terms to the mean of your country, and then you play with the parameters, there is at one point where your perception of inequality is rising because you're really basically only comparing yourself to your own country, and you don't really care that the global inequality is going down. So it's a very tricky part, and that might explain why many people believe that inequality is going up, because that's what they observe. They don't really look at inequality, in Zambia or, China or elsewhere. And so finally, I don't have any, this is really, I can sort of think about that. There are papers that show that democracies are better for inequality. But then, that was, of course, the Acemoglu-Robinson point of view. But then they remarkably leave out actually communist countries, which I think was a mistake, because they were actually countries with totalitarian governments and with low inequality. So you cannot just take it was at some point whatever 1/3 of the mankind and say, well, it doesn't really matter for my model. So I'm not really sure about this, but I would tend to believe that, of course, democracies are better for redistribution, but it's not really some empirical work that I've done.
Any additions to these comments? We'll have another round. But
I again, not being a social scientist, I don't have to have studied it very seriously to be able to comment on it. So I will take on the climate change question, which I've written a little bit about. I think at first order, you'd have to think that the climate change, the inability to use fossil fuels, which were the thing that powered economic development for, the entire period of history since the Industrial Revolution, the fact that that's going to become much more expensive will hurt poor countries more than it hurts rich countries who can make transitions to more expensive renewables and so on. And so the first order is less access to energy to countries that really most desperately need energy. I think that is the overriding impact of the current moment. It could be addressed through transfers. There is, this big $100 billion a year kind of promise to developing countries to help them pay for this transition. I'm not sure that this money will materialize or that it is enough. I think that in the global warming worried community, there is a bit of a misunderstanding of the magnitude of the energy needs in poor countries. So you get people talking about distributed solar in Africa as a solution, like, say, a solar panel on every hut. A solar panel will not power an iron. And if what, Zambia needs is a refrigerated plant for, where, thousands of people can work in the hot summer, distributed solar is really not going to do the trick. So I think that is a really worrisome, global warming is worrisome for a variety of reasons, but I think including the impact it has on inequality around the world.
Carol?
I just wanted to, I have thought a little bit about this democracy and redistribution question, although it's, as Branko mentions, it's very difficult to answer because you can have authoritarian governments like the former Soviet Union that redistributed too much to a point that it was just not productive. You can have democracies with populists that redistribute to the point that they mess up the macroeconomy for years to come with huge costs to the poor. And then you can have democracies like the European ones where there's basically a consensus on how the state should operate, how much citizens are protected by the state. And then you have democracies like the United States, where there's a very strong anti-redistribution sentiment and reality among much of the political establishment, which you could argue means we haven't redistributed enough to reduce inequality. So my hunch, like Branko's, is that democracies are better forms of government and better in reflecting citizens' preferences, but they're not always efficient, and sometimes citizens' preferences can vary tremendously across societies, and then you'll get very different inequality outcomes, not because of the kind of government, but what's sort of the norm about redistribution.
Let me add one thing on Jed's point, because when I gave the example, I was thinking of the diminishing marginal utility in a way counter-argument, but I think it's an interesting, and if anybody, broader issue, including the Rawlsian thing that's in your book. But you can have a view of the world. These are, at the end of the day, value judgments, where, from an ethical point of view, what matters is if basic needs are taken care of, okay? And in that sense, obviously the world has made tremendous progress. I mean, the world 100 years ago was a much worse place in terms of basic needs of human beings than it is now, no question about it. And then in a sense, as the rest is almost irrelevant. I mean, the kind of conservative political arguments will say, well, who cares if the guy has, $1 trillion income? What does it matter? I mean, it doesn't harm anybody, and so there, you can put it that way. The other side, however, I think is the political economy side. Another $10 or $1 to a very poor person compared to another few millions can have politically hugely different impacts. In other words, if your metrics is political influence and power rather than marginal utility of consumption, you could get a very different kind of perspective on that. And one could argue that in terms of what creates the political debate and the political tension, it's much more the latter these days than the former. So, I mean, I think it's a valuable point, but I think it's more complicated than just diminishing marginal utility. Why don't you say one thing about the Rawlsian, the two Rawls' books, I mean, the theory of justice and the theory of peoples, because it goes to Eduardo's point about what's so bad about the fact that we have this, broad convergence, even though within nations there's increasing inequality. And you address it in the Rawlsian debate.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief, because it's a very contentious point, and of course I have to tell you, that's one of the points that maybe many people would disagree with. But when you really look about inequality in the world, this Frantz Fanon situation that we still are living through, it raises really two very important issues. One, what I call global inequality of opportunity. In other words, that actually the same person born in a rich country has multiple, by order of magnitude, higher income than the same person born in a poor country, which raises a political philosophy issue that political philosophers like Rawls have dealt with. And that actually is an issue that has to be brought to the table, because when we speak of inequality of opportunity, implicitly, we only take nation state as our reference. So the question actually can be asked, does really inequality of opportunity end at the national border? And it's a very important question in terms of political philosophy, and Rawls believed that it was the case for the reasons that are long to explain, but basically that there was no compact or the famous veil of ignorance that actually is placed in front of all the citizens in the world, but that each country does it separately. And that may not be something that in a global world we really sort of necessarily have to believe anymore, but that's an important issue. The second problem that is raised by that is the issue of migration, because I really would like to see migration, I make a big point of that, as part of globalization and global inequality, and as a very potent tool for the reduction of global inequality and for the reduction of global poverty. So that really raises all these issues, and the controversial part is there that actually I suggest that if we want to keep that tool working, we have to accommodate the willingness or reluctance of the native populations to allow more migrants by sort of allowing for different status or different statuses in plural, if this is the correct plural, of migrants. So that's a very controversial issue, because it essentially means that not every migrant can immediately claim or expect to get citizenship and the right to stay in that country forever. And to put it very bluntly, it is moving us maybe towards some kind of a combination of the West European and the Gulf state models. Not that the Gulf state model is a good one, but it has an advantage that people go there, make money, send this money back, and make people in India and Bangladesh richer. So that's an advantage, despite the fact that people are discriminated and treated very badly.
Super controversial, but anyway, no, I think Eduardo wants to say something, and I.
Oh yes, I just wanted to. Should we? That question?
Yeah, briefly. Yeah.
You know, the idea of how inequality interacts with democracy is also an interesting point that you actually address at some length in the book, and you know, inequality affects the character of the democratic regime, and so you propose that it'll drive it into either a plutocratic equilibrium, where you know the plutocracy that controls the wealth and power essentially uses this wealth and power to continue with this kind of like unequal distribution of income, and so that essentially traps the country in a certain level of inequality, or actually makes it increase, or in a populist equilibrium, which might be characterized by what we see in some countries in Europe these days, where again, there's really no improvement in inequality. I mean, the democratic institutions do not actually lead to more redistribution and a diminishing of inequality, but actually are captured by different forces that in fact entrench the inequality that's there. So democracies are clearly not like spectacular tools in every instance.
So I just want to try to take people who, Vito, I mean, is it very, very brief? Because there's a gentleman there who hasn't, okay, please, yeah, in the back.
Hi, my name is Muhammad. Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. So the first one, in your book, you are talking about reducing inequality, but not really achieving equality, right? So that's the first one. Because like in our perspective, we want to reduce inequality, but we don't want equality at the end of the day. So that's the first one. Second one, who should be handling or tackling the issue of inequality? Is it markets or governments? Don't you think that a governmental intervention to reduce inequality will result in increasing poverty? Thank you.
Can I do very briefly on that? On the first one, it's very important. We are not talking about two discrete things. It's not like either you have inequality or everybody has the same income. Inequality is like a continuous variable. So you can be high inequality, medium inequality, less medium inequality, and so on. Government versus war, this is a perennial debate. I believe both have a role, so I would let's leave it at that.
Vito, very quickly.
I'll try to be quick. Complex issue, which has been mentioned, is the question of migration, I mean, the most fundamental role of a state is to protect frontiers. As long as people come through the official channels, you can protect frontiers. But when the thousands and thousands come through the sea, then you have a question of civil rights against national rights. It becomes very, very difficult to stop these people. Now we have a situation where we have billions of people who potentially could move in that way in very small areas. Well, that's the greatest, really, challenge to the world that we know. I don't know what is going to happen, but I'd be curious to have some reaction to that.
Anybody else who wants to come in at this point? Okay, quick.
Yeah, when I was talking about the technical industry's impact on jobs, I wasn't talking just about manufacturing jobs, but the bulk of income most people get comes from working. But the technology has shifted that to creating a small number of high-income jobs in the financial sector has, and then leaving more low-income jobs in the service and other sectors. So that shift in the kind of jobs is having an impact on income equality.
Right. Can I take them very, very briefly? On Vito's, actually, I totally agree. I think it's the challenge of the next 100 years. If you look at the numbers, Africa is going to have 4 times as many people as Western, basically EU, in 50 years, or actually at the end of the century, sorry. So that's really, it's a huge challenge. I mean, these people are going to come and to multiply their incomes by 10 times, and Europe is not ready to accept them. So I totally agree. On this other point...
Europe or anywhere else.
Or anywhere else, yes, exactly. That's why I think it's very important to think of migration, not something which really fell from the sky, but within the context of global inequality and inequalities between the countries. Then on services versus manufacturing, actually I have a sort of nice results for the US, where actually obviously inequality within services has increased much more in wages because they're very heterogeneous. than in manufacturing. Moreover, there is, I think, one very important implication. Services are such that actually you have small units and they are dispersed. You cannot have labor force organized in trade unions, and that's one of the reasons why trade union density is declining, because you don't have like any more big plants with 5,000 workers in one place. You have hundreds of units, one which is in the US, another is in India, third one is in Africa. So I think there are many implications there, and moreover, of course, if you don't have trade unions, then you have an issue of the rents, so the workers are losing out, and inequality goes up on that account as well.
We'll take one last round. Just one thing. Branko and I are going to a conference when you said the primary role of a state or a nation is to protect its borders. But the title of the conference we're going to in summer is "Why do we have the nation state?" So, in a sense, you could I mean, the point is why are there these borders? I mean, are they particularly legitimate, particularly God-given, nature-given, whatever? So I mean, I'm just saying from a philosophical point of view, of course we need the nation state. But I think the question you raised, I agree, is one of the biggest questions for the century, because in this globalized world, what is it that allows, and don't think of Italy, think of a small Gulf sheikhdom that by not accident of history, but imperial design of Britain, let's say, is sitting on trillions and trillions of wealth, okay? And somehow, because it is a nation state, has the right to tell the Yemeni or the Pakistani immigrant that she or he doesn't have the same right to opportunity. So I think it's even more complicated than you said, Vito. But anyway, last round. We start with just last few comments, if you have any.
Oh, yes. Indeed. To me, one of the questions that I've grappled with unsuccessfully, of course, is how does this, in the American context, how does this end? And what is the political moment that brings it to an end? And I always, the way I described it was, well, when does the American Jacobin moment happen? Is there a moment that these inequalities, which have rebounded so sharply from the Great Recession and seem to be now going even higher than they were in 2007, is there a moment when this makes the political system explode? Reading Branko's book, and when he was describing this plutocratic system that can evolve from these kind of inequities, it kind of perhaps clarified my thinking and made me wonder whether you get to a point where the plutocracy, in order to defend the system from the pent-up dissatisfaction, anger, and whatnot, finally concedes that inequality has gotten too high. Now, this is pie in the sky, sort of like Snow White type thinking, but when I look at the fact that Donald Trump is there and the challenge that he's imposed to the Republican orthodoxy, which is basically a low taxes, but increasingly lower and lower tax sort of economic policy, and Trump comes with a mixture, with a grab bag of ideas that includes things like maintaining Social Security spending up, and includes perhaps, I mean, depending on what day he's speaking, it might include increasing the minimum wage. You can see, and it's also wrapped in extremely, racist and xenophobic and so on arguments as well. You can see that the Republican orthodoxy could feel threatened enough, perhaps, to change or to, open some space for increased redistribution, for, I don't know, a somewhat bigger EITC, for, the kind of policies that might at some point mitigate, at least at the margin, the increasing growth of concentration of income. I mean, it's me grasping at straws, frankly. So I realize that you could really easily slap this argument down as crazy. But, I do wonder whether that is a dynamic worth considering.
Carol?
Well, lots of different thoughts, but going back to the nation state and immigration point, I think one thing that, I mean, we sort of were stuck with nation states, but their nature may be changing. But on the immigration point, we have this model where we assume that everybody that migrates wants to come and be American. And so they either come, they get full rights, and then if they don't, they can't leave. They're stuck here. Maybe they want to leave. Maybe they want to come and work a while and go home to wherever they're from. But they're sort of either if you migrate illegally and you are stuck in a nation state you may not want to be in, you may not even want to be a citizen of, you may just want to work, versus other people want to come and be citizens. And even when you think about the great migration crisis now in Europe, I mean, I'm sure plenty of Syrians would love to go back to Syria if there were ever peace there. You know, it's not clear that they want to be Danish. And so it strikes me that this sort of the kind of very rigid nation state management, I mean, nation states have a right to manage who comes in and out of their countries, but that this kind of, it's still very locked in sort of black and white terms. And I think it is a time we should be thinking about it differently, both because of inequality and because it's such a huge crisis, a global crisis.
And Branko touches it. I mean, we may agree or not with his policy prescription, but he definitely touches on this in the book. Branko, last word.
Well, last word, because we were on that, you know, and we knew the migration would become a big topic, so Kemal and I agreed that we would just bring it at the very end, because it's a book not about migration. Migration is only within that, you know, sort of scheme of things of global inequality. But, you know, what I actually just asked somebody who disagrees with me is to acknowledge that there is a trade-off between giving all the rights of citizenship, which entail not only voting rights, but obviously working rights, rights to social security, and everything else that the citizen has, there is a trade-off between doing that and willingness to accept migrants. Once you agree that there is a downward sloping line, there is a trade-off, that if we give native population gives less rights, they would be more open to having more migrants, then everything else follows. We can agree at which point we should draw the line, but I actually think that we need to re-examine the idea of citizenship as a binary category, which is either 0, that you're not a citizen, we don't care about you, or you are 1, you're a citizen, you have all the rights. Once we actually accept to re-examine that, then I think we will actually maybe agree. Different countries will put the equilibrium point at different, equilibrium at different points. But we would actually really move towards using migration as a tool for reduction of global poverty and global inequality, and making it compatible with the acceptance of the local populations. Because if native populations don't want migrants, then this big tool of the reduction is just going not to be used.
Thank you very much, and I think this gives me an idea to try to organize an event like this with the title, Multiple Identities, Different Levels of Nationalities.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good one.
Anyway, thanks a lot for coming. Thanks, Branko, for doing this here, and thank you for the panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you.